This is the first part of the lecture on the neurons, the nervous system, and the endocrine system at the beginning of the biological psychology unit. This first portion of the lecture will be given on Thursday, October 1st. The first part of our lecture is on neurons and neurotransmitters. So, what are neurons? Well, neurons are cells of the nervous system. Neurons make up the entirety of, or the main parts of the cells in our brain, our spinal cord, and our nervous system's connections to all our internal organs and muscles. There are three primary types of neurons. The most common type of neuron is an interneuron. An interneuron is found primarily within the brain and the spinal cord. The interneuron connects with other interneurons, and then outside of the spinal cord will connect with the sensory and motor neurons that make up the rest of our body and connect with our internal organs and our muscles. Sensory neurons are the types of neurons that send information back up to the brain. So if there was any sort of stimulation outside of the body, the sensory neurons would register it and then send that in the forms of electrical currents all the way up the spinal cord and then to the brain. The motor neuron are the outbound signals. They're the signals that the brain is sending out. So the brain will send this out primarily to our muscles to make them move, but also to our internal organs like our heart, our lungs, our stomach, to provide instructions and directions on what those organs should do. When we look at a neuron, there are four primary parts. The first part is the cell body, or sometimes referred to as the soma. The cell body's primary purpose is to keep the cell alive. That's it. That's all it does. Is it has the protein, gets the proteins from the bloodstream and other forms of nourishment, and it keeps the cell alive. Neurons work as passers of messages, but they don't pass a single message from one part of the body all the way to the brain. The way that it works is that each cell passes its own messages and then receives messages from the previous cell. So the cell will receive a message from the previous cell in the form of neurotransmitters, and then that cell will send its own neurotransmitters, chemical compounds, to the next cell in the form of this message, and the process will repeat itself. If you think about it like a big game of telephone where not a lot is lost because it happens so quickly, that's kind of what we're talking about here. The axon is the big long tail of the cell. In many cases, the axon is very short, but in some cases, the axon can be as long as over a foot, like the neurons that make up our legs and connect to the muscles in our legs and feet. The axon is the part of the cell that sends all the messages. They're the ones that release these chemical compounds called neurotransmitters so that the cell can pass the messages. The dendrite are those hairish, tree-ish looking things that are connected to the cell body. And the dendrites are the receivers of the cell. So they're the ones that receive the messages from other cells. They're the ones that receive the neurotransmitters, these chemical compounds from other cells. This will then stimulate the cell and creates an electrical charge, which then causes the cell to pass its own neurotransmitters to the next one. The myelin sheath is that layer of fat that surrounds the axon. You can kind of see it in the diagram here. It's a little bit white. The myelin sheath is fat, and what it does is it causes the sending of the messages to occur more quickly. Because these messages are sent electrically, and fat is a good conductor of electricity, it allows these connections to be established in a faster way. Once this electrical connection goes all the way down the axon, the sending part of the cell, at the tip of the cell, it releases its neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical compounds, and they can affect our mood and our behavior in a variety of different ways, which we will be covering in the next part of the lecture on the next class day. When these neurotransmitters are released out of the axon of the cell, they have to cross a microscopic gap known as the synapse, or sometimes called the synaptic gap. The synapse is about 1/10,000th of an inch wide, so it's a very, very microscopic little journey that these cells have to make. But these cells are released by this electrical charge that's been created in the cell. They cross this microscopic gap, and they find themselves on the receptor sites of the receiving neuron, on the dendrites of the receiving neuron. These receptor sites are specific for each different type of neurotransmitter. They kind of work like a lock, and the neurotransmitter would be a key. So if the wrong neurotransmitter hits that receptor site, it's not going to do anything to the cell. But if the correct neurotransmitter embeds itself within the receptor site, it's going to create stimulation in the next cell, which generates that electrical charge so that the next cell can send its neurotransmitters on to the next one after that. Once the binding of the receptor sites is done, there's always going to be excess neurotransmitters in the synapse, but they don't stay floating around in this microscopic gap. Instead, they get reabsorbed back into the original cell. This is a process called reuptake, and it allows the cell to fire off its neurotransmitters again and again and again, never depleting it of the neurotransmitter because they're always going to reabsorb the extra neurotransmitters. This is where we're going to stop in the class on Thursday, October 1st, and then do an assignment called Build a Neuron.